like us. The DNA information trade was the first World Wide Web. Any bacterium to this day can trade DNA genes with any other. And at first they had to rub up against each other and trade through holes in their cell walls, and then they invented viruses, which were ways of packaging whole genomes and scattering them abroad where they could be carried on the wind or whatever, and usually they were addressed, and if the wrong person opened the mail, they got into trouble. They were trying to do it right. Here's the bacterial motor. It's very complicated. It takes over 40 kinds of proteins to make all these parts with the rotor and the stator and the propeller and the joints and the fuel and all to drive a tail on the bacterium. Do I have a live one? Yeah. There we go. You see it's going around. Now, the reason you can find schematics of these bacterial motors built into the cell wall there now is because the nanotechnology people are very, very interested in them. They want to be able to make these nanomotors. And they think they can do it by assembling the molecules, and I don't think they're going to succeed. But we've been enslaving bacteria for a long time to do our dirty work, from the time we enslaved them to make beer and yogurt and bread and things like that, to when we got to do genetic engineering and we got bacteria to carry genes into new organisms that didn't have them before. And now we will probably try to interface their motors with some kind of nanomachinery, getting ourselves deeper and deeper into trouble because we don't really understand how life works. Now, protists are the big nucleated cells that evolved as colonies of ancient bacteria, which initially were invading each other so that the high-tech motorized bacteria would invade the big sluggish fermenters and maybe take aboard some blue-greens, and then they figured out that the blue-greens could make food for the colony, and the ones with the motors could get on the outside and propel them along and get them into a light where the blue-greens could make the food and so on, so that instead of just invading each other and reproducing until there was no more food and the thing died, they found that they could keep the colony going through a division of labor, and by giving up some of their own DNA to a central library of DNA we call the nucleus. So the colonies, they each gave up some of their DNA to form this nucleus, and you end up with a multi-creatured cell, the one on the right. This is a bacterium. Whoever drew it didn't know about the motor, so it wouldn't work very well. And then up there where you see the mitochondria in the big cell, those are the descendants of these free-living breathers. And there are thousands of these in each cell, making your energy. And the cell on the right is actually on the average 1,000 times bigger than a bacterium. So you see how you can have lots of them inside one of your cells. So a single cell in our bodies is a very, very complex arrangement, and I'll show you more about that. But now here's the part of evolution that you learned in school that's easy. The multicelled creatures. Remember, we started with a multi-creatured cell. Now we have multicelled creatures evolving only in the last quarter of evolution in the ancient seas at first, then coming out to land, populating the continents, and then eventually we get this big brain experiment of which we are a part. And the results are not quite in yet about how successful it's going to be. But we can see now that evolution is going to be a whole Earth phenomenon. And indeed, after every major extinction in the history of our planet, as when the extinction was over, suddenly you had big batches of new species, not slow, accidental Darwinian lineages. There's never been a demonstrated long-term Darwinian lineage. We can guess that one thing evolved from another, but you can't, when they do the DNA studies, it often doesn't come out right. For instance, the Museum of Natural History in New York used to have the evolution of the horse exhibit, and it got into all kinds of biological textbooks. And when they got so that they could measure DNA, they found these skeletons were quite unrelated. They just looked like a good series when you lined them up. So I call this crisis as opportunity because what we found was that every time there was a huge wipeout, an extinction, a whole new batch of life appears at once. The Cambrian explosion was one such example, many life forms emerging in the sea at once. And then when the dinosaurs went out in the last big extinction about 60 million years ago, afterwards there were all kinds of mammals, not a slow evolution of one after the other, but all together. So no creature is a thing in itself, apart from all others. It's always co-creation of whole ecosystems, of the earth as a whole. So if all species have co-evolved, what's our responsibility to the others? How do we fit within this web of life? Now let's look at this cycle of evolution one more time simultaneously. How can it play out in the great eternal now? Well, here's how our theories of evolution at present work. We have Darwin saying that competition happens among individuals, that this is what drives evolution, competition and scarcity among individuals. Someone noticed how much altruism there was within species and said, no, it must be competition among species for the niches, because the animals within a species often get along. In fact, we're pretty unique in nature for killing each other off within our species. That is an extremely rare phenomenon in nature. And then along came Richard Dawkins and said, no, you're both wrong. It's actually competition among selfish genes. Right? Okay, here's my version. How does evolution proceed? By self-interest at all levels simultaneously. The self-interest of the individual, the self-interest of the species, which is the larger holon, and the self-interest of the cells and molecules within the individuals. And here's an example from your own body. If every molecule in your body's holarchy has self-interest at every level, now the organs also have their self-interest, and so do the whole organ systems and the whole body. What happens? The self-interest at all levels forces negotiations among the levels. There's nothing wrong with self-interest, provided it's contained by a larger community of self-interest. You see, it's critical that you think holarchy, and then you can see how the self-interest can drive cooperation. A couple is a two-level holarchy. There are two people, two individuals, and there's couplehood. If you're trying to decide whether to go to the movies or the opera next week, finances belong to couplehood, to the self-interest of couplehood. So you're not just negotiating with each other, you're negotiating between the integrity of couplehood and the integrity of and desires of individuals. You see? So thinking holarchy is a very, very useful thing. You get dynamic harmony out of self-interest at all levels. And I haven't found anyone else talking about this. Now imagine your body's economy were run the way our world economy is run today. Imagine that we call the heart-lung system the northern industrial organs, and we give them ownership of all the bones in the body where the raw material blood cells are formed, as you know, in the marrow of bones. So they can mine these and sweep these raw material blood cells up to the northern industrial heart-lung system and purify the blood and add oxygen to it so that there's a useful product to be distributed from the heart center, which announces then the body price for blood and distributes blood to the organs that can afford it. And I suppose would bottle the rest until somebody can buy it. Does it work? Can our bodies stay healthy in that kind of an economic system? Can our world? You see, are our global economics consistent with living systems economics? We need to look to nature for some guidance because it's had billions of years to evolve cooperative systems. If this were only a dog-eat-dog world, do you think bodies with 100 trillion cells, each of which is more complex than a big city, working in harmony together every day for you, every night for you, could that have evolved if we were always in a situation of hostile competition and scarcity? You see, it's a vastly complex cooperative system that each of us are, and it evolved in the natural world. A family, local or global, can thrive only when all members of the family thrive. Everybody who's in a family knows that if one person in the family is really ill or mentally ill or in trouble or whatever, the whole family system is disrupted until you get everybody working well again.